Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another ASUS motherboard, this time the very lowest of the low end for X570, the Prime X570-P. There is basically nothing on this motherboard, except of course the extremely useful extra 4-pin next to our 8-pin power connector. I'm not, like, I think at this point you've probably seen enough of my videos that I don't even need to talk about how useful or how not useful the extra 4-pin is. Anyway, you may be wondering, wait a minute, this is on a mod mat. Is this a picture from Steve? No, it isn't. This is again a picture from let's just say from the internet. Because as usual with these X570 ASUS motherboards, I'm technically not supposed to have any pictures until, like, you know, launch day or something. But here we are. We have the X570-P, and this is the very cheapest X570 board ASUS is doing. And I mean, there's no debug LEDs, there's no post code, there's no BIOS flashback actually, which is that's actually kind of maybe a deal breaker with this board for a lot of people, because a lot of the other board vendors do have BIOS flashback on their entire lineup for X570, like Gigabyte. Gigabyte has BIOS flashback everywhere. MSI, I think, has BIOS. Yeah, MSI also has BIOS flashback literally everywhere. There's even a lot of B450 and like X470 boards with BIOS flashback as well. And it's just like, and then there's this X570 board, which, you know, has as far as X570 prices go, it's cheap, but being an X570 board, cheap has a very different meaning because, well, from what I've heard, the chipset on these boards is almost as expensive as some of the really, really low-end B350 and B450 boards. Like, if you wanted to build a board with this chipset, you basically have a minimum price tag of the bill of material price of the chipset, and the chipset's around like $30 to $40 from what I've heard. So it is a very, very expensive chipset. So making low-end boards with this chipset is just kind of not a thing, because you can't go below the price of the chipset, right? So, and then anything you add on top of that, that's just like, okay, well, you also want to make some margin. And so the end result is that, yeah, the cheapest of the X570 boards are still not exactly cheap. But there's basically nothing on them in terms of features because, well, you know, the chipset kind of hogs all of the price tag to itself. But anyway, so yeah, like there's not really much of anything here. So we may as well just start looking at right at the VRM, because that's really the only thing worth covering on this board. So this lovely L, of course, is the VRM on this board. And this one's like probably the least weird of the ASUS VRMs. So we have a +2 SoC over here, and then we have a 4-phase V-core. So actually, I normally do it as V-core, and then 4+2. So the controller, as usual, because low-end ASUS motherboard, it's going to be an ASP1106, which is the standard low-end voltage controller for ASUS motherboards, though on Z390, and actually even on X570, they do have quite a few rather expensive, like mid-range to even high-end boards where you still have the ASP1106. And then we have the, you know, ASUS standard of more components per phase than you absolutely need to make a phase, but it does give you extra power delivery capability. So we are looking at a bunch of DRMOS power stages, so SiC 639s, which are 50 amp DRMOS parts from Vishay Semiconductor. They also have some temperature monitoring functionality built in, which say the SiC 634 doesn't have, but in terms of efficiency, it's basically the same as the SiC 634. And, you know, at this point, you might be like, wait a minute, so ASP1106, 4+2 phase VRM, SiC 639, 50 amp DRMOS from Vishay Semiconductor. You know, we have 2 of these power stages per phase, and there's 4 phases. Haven't we seen a VRM configuration like this somewhere else? On Z390, maybe? On like a motherboard that costs like, I don't know, close to, well over $300. And if you were thinking that, you'd be correct, because this VRM is in fact, like, as far as the power stages go, as well as the controller goes, this is the exact same thing you would get on a Maximus 11 Hero, or a Maximus 11 Code, or a Maximus 11 Formula, because all 3 of those boards use these exact same power stages, and this exact same controller in basically the exact same configuration. The main difference is on there, instead of like +2 SoC, you have +2 iGPU, and here the SoC VRM is again, you know, 2 power stages per phase, so like that's a phase and that's a phase. Oh right, I came up with the ingenious idea to use dashed lines, and then here yeah, okay, well, there's your phase split, right? So phase 1, phase 2, and again, you just have more of those SIC 639s. So that's kind of the only difference between this VRM and what you would get on like a Maximus 11 Hero, is just, yeah, the SoC VRM here is, well, the extra rail, because Intel doesn't have an SoC. They have VCCSA, VCCIO, which are much lower current rails than SoC is, and then they have an iGPU rail. Yeah, SoC here kind of does the, like, SoC, it does the same stuff as IO, SA, iGPU combined. That's why it's, and previously it would actually, well, whatever. We're not going to get into that. Nobody cares. Or at least I don't care. Like, so, yeah. So, you know, and this board is like proof, in my opinion, that ASUS was really cheap with the VRM on the Maximus 11 Hero. I'm not saying bad. I'm saying cheap. The VRM was cheap, and it was cheap. And here you have proof that it was cheap, because this is the cheapest board they're making for X570, and you get basically the same VRM. There's a difference between cheap and bad, right? Like, you can be cheap and good, but when you're cheap and the board is expensive, then it's like, why is the board still expensive if the VRM is so cheap? And there's not really anything else on those boards to make up for it, in my opinion. But anyway, on this board, there's nothing. So it's like, this one doesn't have to defend its price tag too much, because there's barely, well, actually, I'd argue, yeah, some of the thing is technically speaking, at this price point, this VRM is actually quite, like, well, yeah, it's really quite good. It's just that, I don't know, like, this board is at that level of there's not enough features that I would not buy it just because there's not enough features. Also, ASUS has a board with, like, slightly more features and a substantially better VRM of their own again, so that kind of, this board is, but, you know, if you were going for the cheapest X570 board, then yeah, the VRM on this is quite capable, because you do get 8 power stages, and they are 50 amp parts, so power efficiency wise, this thing really doesn't do a bad job. So 1.2 volts output, 500 kilohertz switching frequency, 5 volts drive. You're going to be looking at about the sort of following heat dissipation figures for the power stages in this VRM. That's going to be 100 amps output, is going to be producing about 10 watts of heat. So if you put honestly, if they used this exact VRM on, like, well, at the time these power stages didn't exist, so yeah, that wasn't possible. But this VRM is actually like a straight up upgrade from what they had on the X470-Pro. In fact, it's it's arguably an upgrade over a lot of X470 motherboards. Like, this is really quite a good VRM, except for the relatively low phase count, but there's ways to work around that I've talked about in other videos. So yeah, anyway, 100 amps output, 10 watts of heat. 150 amps output, you'd be looking at about 16 watts of heat, which again, like, that's actually really decent, right? That's not really that hot. It's around 20 watts that you really start needing heat sinks with, even like a smaller VRM like this. Because if the VRM physically takes up a lot of board space, then it acts as its own heat sink to a larger extent than if it's smaller, right? So it's kind of what's going on with that. 200 amps output. At this point, it's going to start producing about 22 watts of heat. After all, like, this VRM powers 9900Ks on the regular quite easily. Like, it's not a bad VRM. It's just that it's dirt cheap to produce, which I'd say is just like, congratulations, Vishay Semiconductor, for making a 50 amp power stage for $1 a piece. Like, literally, these are $1 a piece if you're buying them in bulk. So yeah, that's really great about these components. It's just like, you can get some really cost-effective VRM solutions with them. I'm just not a fan of when that very cost-effective VRM solution shows up on a motherboard that costs almost $300 or in excess of $300, right? Like, come on, like, it's a really expensive motherboard. Do something with that price tag. Anyway, so 200 amps output, 22 watts of heat. At that point, the heatsinks actually do start playing a role, and in the heatsink department, we are looking at this, which is a huge upgrade over what they had on the X470-Pro. Like, I'm super, like, the X570 boards across the board is just like, if we, like, the thing is, I refuse to believe that this heatsink is significantly more expensive than what they had on the X470 Prime Pro. But this heatsink is so much better because, like, if you wanted to convert this heatsink into the one they had on the Prime Pro, you would basically remove this fin. Like, this isn't a ton of a surface area, but you would basically remove this whole thing and that whole thing and this little nub over there. You'd get rid of all of that, and then you'd have like the heatsink they had for the X470 Prime Pro, which is just like, well, that's not a heatsink, that's a fashion accessory because it's basically just a T like that, and there's no surface area. And this isn't that much better, but like you have like, well, actually no, it's probably like 100% or like well over 100% more surface area, right? Like if you just consider these two fins right here, that's more than 100% more surface area than what you get on a lot of on some of the X470 boards. So yeah, and then there's this secondary heatsink, right? And the thing is like this heatsink is only handling 3 of the phases, and then this heatsink is handling the other, like what the 1 V-core phase and the 2 SoC phases. So yeah, like this VRM should do, like, it will probably get quite warm, but it shouldn't actually have any thermal issues, especially if you were running like a 2700X or something on this. Like a 2700X would be no problem because the 2700X falls into that, you know, into this gap right here between the 100 amps and 150 amps, and 16 watts of heat for heat sinks like that should be no problem whatsoever. 200 amps still should be just fine. Like this board, like I think that's what you can say about a lot of the X570 boards, is that they're all designed to handle even the 3950X. Like even the cheapest ones, well, some of the cheap ones more so than others, but even the cheapest ones should do a pretty good job of maxing out a 3950X, assuming that they're not being like stripped down in terms of BIOS settings. Because yeah, it's just like VRM upgrades and heatsink upgrades across the board from all of the vendors, and the end result is that, yeah, like, you know, the cheapest X570 board ASUS makes can do 200 amps output quite comfortably between the heatsinks that it has and the, you know, 50 amp power stages that it's using. So yeah, like not a bad board for the price tag. Anyway, going up to sort of theoretical current outputs, which, like, again, these are like LN2 territory, but I like to go there just to show how capable a VRM is under very high, like higher loads. But 300 amps output, this VRM would produce about 45 watts of heat, at which point these heat sinks are going to be, I'd say these heat sinks would probably be overwhelmed at that point. But if you threw a fan on them, they should be enough, right? Like the thing about airflow is that it makes a huge difference compared to just relying on like convection, because convection kind of sucks at moving large volumes of air. Anyway, so 300 amps output, like you'd need a fan, and this is not really a practical concern anyway. And then going up to 360 amp output, which is where the data sheet stops, because technically, like, yes, these are 50 amp rated power stages, but the data sheet for their performance graphs, they only go up to 45 amps, because nobody in their right mind is actually going to try to run a 50 amp power stage at 50 amps output, because that's not what you do. Except maybe like some server applications might actually run into a scenario where that makes sense, but because on server boards, there's different design considerations, and the cooling setup is completely different, right? Like Delta fans make for a very effective way to deal with any amount of heat output. But anyway, 360 amps, this VRM is going to be producing about 70 watts of heat. And at that point, like, yeah, that's not viable whatsoever unless you threw like a water block on the VRM. But like, yeah, I mean, this is for the fact that this is ASUS's cheapest X570 board, this is a really solid VRM. I mean, for the most part, it's the same VRM you'd get on a Maximus 11 Hero, which is why I feel like the Maximus 11 Hero is actually even the Formula, because all three of like Formula, Code, Hero, same VRM on those on Z390, and very similar to this. So yeah, here I'd say great. This is exactly the kind of board that I'd say this VRM is like meant for, where it's like you need a lot of current throughput because it might potentially end up running a 3950X, and the VRM is dirt cheap to build. And yeah, this is a perfect example of where this makes sense. So a well-fit VRM for the board. And also, funny thing about this board is there's a K-type thermocouple hole in the CPU socket. I have no idea what that's doing there, because it's just like nobody in their right mind is going to run this on LN2. Like there's nothing on this board, right? Like Even all of your SATA, like most of your SATA ports are freaking vertical like this because the horizontal ones cost more to implement. So yeah, and your audio section is like stripped down to, I don't pay that much attention to audio 2.1, I think. I'm not sure. But yeah, like audio section is just stripped down to that, right? Like there's barely any rear IO. Like it couldn't get more bare bones than this, but you still get a solid VRM. So that's pretty neat. SoC VRM, actually, like for APU overclocking, this VRM is really, really solid as well because you do get two full 50 amp power stages per phase. So overclocking, like actually for an APU, this is quite overkill. But yeah, like solid VRM for a motherboard this cheap, though I think honestly I would have sacrificed two of the, like, I would have honestly been a fan if they just sacrificed like those two extra chokes and power stages and gave you more IO or like added flashback or troubleshooting LEDs or anything else, because like maybe upgrade the audio section, though I don't really like, I don't pay attention to audio, so I'm not going to talk about if it's good or bad. Just like, I don't know, like I feel like 50 amp power stages for an APU, two of them should be more than enough. I don't really feel like you need four. Actually, you definitely don't need four. Especially considering that this has an actual heatsink on the VRM. It's just that, yeah, so, could have scrapped that in my opinion. Arguably, they could have also gone with less output filtering capacitors, but that would maybe be pushing it. But yeah, like this board, VRM is definitely solid. It's just that the feature set of this thing is just like, not really a set of features. It's like a couple. For the capacitors, which I forget to mention all of the time because aluminum polymers really aren't that interesting, and also board vendors don't use that many different brands of capacitors. ASUS here is going with this is actually another thing that's kind of interesting, is with this board they are going for Nichicons, which are generally more expensive than, like, a lot of boards will go for APAC capacitors, which is Taiwanese brand of capacitor, and their aluminum polymers rated for 5,000 hours. While ASUS with this board, they're going for Nichicon FP 5K series capacitors, which these are generally more expensive than the APAC alternatives. In terms of performance, I'm not sure that there's much of a difference. These are also rated for 5,000 hours at 105 degrees. Not that this VRM should ever be really hitting that kind of temperature, except maybe if it's in like a really low airflow environment with a 3950X running like Prime 95 small FFTs completely maxed out, at which point, yeah, you'd be hitting that there. And the heatsink should still be capable of dealing with that just fine. Like, this VRM is such a huge upgrade over what we'd see on a lot of X470 boards that it's just like, it doesn't really compare. Yeah, and then for the 12 volt input bulk filtering capacitor, for the input filtering capacitors, we're looking at more Nichicon FP5K series capacitors that, actually no, these are APACs. Okay, so they are actually using APACs, because I just noticed that little logo right there. So that is APAC, but those are still 5K rated. And that's a Taiwanese cap maker, and those are also aluminum polymers, so I wouldn't be concerned about them. So there's a mishmash of capacitors based on what's cost effective, right? So like that's a 6.3 volt Nichicon FP5K, that's a 16 volt APAC capacitor, because actually generally, like, you pay an extra for high voltage ratings and high capacity at high voltage ratings, right? That's why the higher voltage caps are actually all APACs, which makes sense, because those are going to be, like, Nichicon 16 volt rated capacitors would be significantly more expensive than these, whereas for the lower voltage, like these are 6.3 volts, there it wouldn't be as much of a cost difference. Anyway, we go on to the back of the board, we can actually see that we can't see any memory traces, but the topology, I'm going to say, is 99%. It's going to be daisy chain. Just because daisy chain was the, daisy chain was the standard for X470, and then for X570, I can't see a reason for it not to be daisy chain again. Especially, like, the thing is, you can tune a high layer count, like, well-designed daisy chains with properly tuned memory controller settings can get very, very close to what a T-topology setup will do. like a couple hundred megahertz difference at most. So if AMD went and actually optimized the memory controller to work with daisy chain properly, you're not going to notice much of a difference between a T-top board and a daisy chain board on 4-DIMM configurations, but on a 2-DIMM configuration, daisy chain is just going to obliterate a T-topology board. So that's kind of why all of the board, like most of the board vendors except ASRock, seem to be going for daisy chain entirely for that reason. It's just like you can make daisy chain work really, really well if you put in the effort. And then when you're on 2x8, it's just, or 2x6, or any 2-DIMM configuration, daisy chain just absolutely wins without any contest. So yeah, but we can't see any memory traces on the back of the board because we're looking at power plane fills and ground fills. I think this, like this center section looks suspiciously like a memory voltage power plane rather than a ground fill, but yeah. So that's kind of what's going on with that. And this board, as far as I know, is also a 6-layer PCB. So yeah, even on the cheapest board, they're going for 6 layers, which partially is also just to get the PCIe 4.0 to work. It's not necessarily for the memory. It's just like PCIe 4.0 has signal integrity concerns that you can only really address with more layers. Though there are some X570 boards that are still 4 layers as well from some vendors. So yeah, not sure how that'll impact anything. Honestly, it should be fine because I doubt anybody would ship a PCIe. Like, I don't think AMD would allow anybody to sell a PCIe 4.0 board where it's just like, oh, it doesn't actually run PCIe 4.0 because the signal integrity for the first slot is too bad. And then, of course, this slot is the other 4.0 slot because that one goes to the chipset. So, yeah. That's the X570-P from ASUS. Not really much on here, right? Like, you get a solid VRM and then you don't get much else. But I guess if you're just going for a, like, if you don't think you need a lot of features, assuming that they didn't, like, gut the BIOS for this board as well, which some, like, a lot of board vendors will do that. As you buy a cheaper board, they'll steadily, like, start taking out features from the BIOS, which aren't even dependent on the feature set of the motherboard itself. So as long as they didn't gut the BIOS, this would actually be a pretty solid board as long as you don't care about like having a good audio section, having a ton of USB ports, which you can get add-in cards to get more USB ports, and they do have 2 3.0 headers on the board itself. So, you know, it's like yeah, this would potentially be a really like there's a very strong argument to go for this board over a lot of other boards, in my opinion. Like, because it's not that bad in any sort of, at least physically, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's just that, yeah, it has a reduced feature set because it's as cheap as it gets for X570. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Huge thanks to the source of the pictures for this board. And then thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. I also have a Teespring. You can find a links to both down in the description below. Teespring is obviously for like merch, like shirts, socks, posters. And the Patreon is if you just want to support me directly and you don't want to buy anything. So you can find links to both down in the description below. They help out with running the channel immensely because they allow me to do things like actually buy boards to test on launch day buy boards to yeah, actually that statement made sense. I don't know why I decided that didn't make sense. So anyway, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching and goodbye.